Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. My name is Carl Stitchen, and I'm the Director of IALS. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to Law and Humanities in a Pandemic. This series of monthly remote workshops seeks to make sense of the wide-ranging relationship between law and the pandemic through the insights of the humanities, broadly understood as the set of cultural influences which are shaping the use of law and the responses to it. As part of the School of Advanced Study in the University of London, the Institute is committed to a spirit of interdisciplinary inquiry focused on the humanities as a means of better understanding the world we face. Today's workshop is entitled Gendering the Pandemic and features 3 papers. Our format is as follows. Authors will have up to 20 minutes to present their paper, and questions can be raised by our audience members in the Q&A function at any time. Following each presentation, I will attempt to moderate questions to that presenter and also to raise your general questions and comments at the end of the session. The workshops are scheduled for 90 minutes. We also now have closed captioning available, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to activate or turn this function off as you wish. Our first paper today is by Dr. Kim Barker and Dr. Olga Jaraz. Kim is a senior lecturer in law at the Open University in the UK. Her research interests are internet regulation and intellectual property law. Her research focuses on the online regulation of platforms and specifically online abuses, online violence, and the legal responsibilities of internet actors. Olga is also a senior lecturer in law at the Open University. Her research focuses on international law, human rights, and legal responses to violence against women, including online violence, specializing in feminist perspectives on law in these areas. Their paper today is entitled Women, Violence, and Protest in Times of COVID-19. Kim and Olga, over to you.
Thank you. Hope you can see the slides.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay. So if Zoom is cooperating and everybody can see the slides, we're going to kick off with our paper today, which is about women, violence and protest in times of COVID-19. And in a nutshell, what we've seen fairly recently throughout pandemic times is the ways in which disruption has occurred in every aspect of everyday life. We've seen a huge transformation in societal tendencies, hierarchical norms, competing tensions, and all of these things have burst to life in the last, I'm going to say 12 months, but really 18 months or so. And it's shifted all of the things we had taken for granted in terms of a normal, everyday kind of life as we knew it. It's also caused a huge amount of regression for the gender equality agenda. And what we've seen, particularly recently with some initial research emerging, is there's been a huge change in the way in which issues relating to gender have come to the forefront. We've seen increases in domestic abuse. There's been roughly a 30% increase in cases of domestic abuse worldwide during the pandemic. We've been talking about domestic abuse and gender-based violence for a prolonged period of time as a shadow pandemic. But actually, the COVID-19 pandemic has shifted that discussion and moved gendered issues, including domestic abuse, domestic violence, to the forefront. But it's broader than that. We've also seen domestic and political issues come to the forefront with gender connotations. We've seen the pandemic disrupt everything in terms of freedom, the ability to protest, access to healthcare, who can access healthcare, how we access services, how we protect our freedoms, how we campaign for our freedoms, but also the ways in which the pandemic has impacted particularly badly on those who are perhaps in a more precarious position in society. And there is a very clear gendered element to that aspect of society. So in some respects, the pandemic disruption, as one of the 4 elements of things we're going to talk about today, shows that we have gone backwards somewhat in terms of gender equality and the elements that we wanted to focus on moving forward through 2020 into 2030 and onwards. And the UN Population Fund has highlighted the particular precarious nature for women and the gendered elements of the pandemic by predicting that there are 15 million cases of gender-based violence for every 3-month period of lockdown. So while pre-lockdown and pre-COVID, we were making incremental inroads into tackling gender equality and highlighting women's rights and making significant progress and advancing in that, COVID-19 pandemic and all of its massive repercussions, which are not just gendered, but which have a particularly pronounced gender element to them, all of that has been disrupted. It's caused massive regression. And the disruption has not just been to women. It's not just been to social norms. It's not just been to women's rights. It's been across the board. And so disrupted normality is the starting point for our discussion about women, violence and protests during COVID-19. But it's not just disruption in terms of women's rights. There's also been disruption to the narrative around the importance of rights. We've seen particular issues with protests. We've seen really significant issues in terms of the way in which we tackle issues surrounding protests, but we've also seen disruption to healthcare. We've seen disruption to the ways in which people are held accountable during the pandemic or not accountable, given some of the recent issues that have emerged, the highest levels of government in the last 2 or 3 weeks. But also we've seen that the pandemic highlights inequalities much more broadly. We see that there's an over-reliance on technology, and that over-reliance on technology is also part and parcel of how we now access things, the reliance we have on technology to make appointments for things, to do track and trace. But there is also a broader impact on the disruption and the economic disruption attached to that as well. And if you don't have economic power because you've been affected by the pandemic, then you might not have access to the latest technology. You might not be able to engage fully with track and trace systems, which rely on smartphones. You might not be able to fully engage with your local community, which has gone all online. You might not be sitting at events like this one today, which are all technologically reliant. And all of that is pandemic disruption, and all of that is subverted narrative around the ways in which we talk about all of these different things that are going on pandemic-wise. And all of that has manifested itself, obviously, in a different form of reaction. We have different forms of legal scrutiny. We've seen different ways of making law, if you like. In the last year or so, we've seen Parliament suspended. We've seen much greater reliance on statutory instruments. And all of this has had significant impacts, not necessarily directly, but also indirectly, where there's no accountability. Women's rights have been shoved away from the forefront. But women's rights and protection for women's rights are more important in the pandemic, given the very significant gendered impacts of it. And what we've seen is women standing up very clearly for their rights, but also beyond that, what we've seen is women standing up and fighting for their rights, irrespective of the pandemic. And so the element of freedom and democracy is one of the core elements that we're going to move on to talk about later on in the presentation today. But what we actually see as we kind of think about this in a more significant way are the broad spectrum of different elements of disruption, but also the different elements of gender. And some of the gendered elements are more pronounced and more significant than other elements. So a number of key factors in the pandemic that have really distinct gendered impacts. We see the gender pay gap exacerbated by pandemic-related unemployment. We see the impact upon economic power and the connotations of that, access to technology, access to resources, the ability to engage fully. We also see, as a direct consequence of the pandemic, 4.5 million new carers are estimated to have been created due to the COVID-19 pandemic situation. We know that they are predominantly unpaid and predominantly low-paid roles filled, again, predominantly by women. So there's a kind of a spiral effect. All of these things have a distinct knock-on. We also see the combination of those two elements combining to lead to increased poverty levels. It's a corollary of unemployment and underemployment, but also we see that that lack of economic power compounds other pandemic inequalities, given the reliance on technology for work, for communication, for entertainment, and for essential supplies from non-essential shops, but also access to healthcare, making appointments, and managing everyday life that would otherwise have been less technologically reliant. We also see that within all of that, there is a significant, sorry, I'm just told the slides have not moved on. Let me try that again, because on mine they have. Is that better?
We're not on a full screen.
Okay. Well, I am on a full screen, so I don't know why that is happening.
But do carry on.
Yeah. Just give me a second. I've now lost the slides entirely.
There. That's working now.
Perfect. I don't know why it wasn't working before. But anyway, we can see that in all of these issues, there has been a spark in community activity as a direct consequence of some of the online elements that have filled some of the space where we would ordinarily have been doing offline things. And ultimately what we see is different issues coming to the fore, which have all triggered a much broader movement in terms of accountability and protest. And the distinct issues that we see really arising are all women oriented, but women are stepping up in caring, they're stepping up to fill in the gaps in society. We have a huge number of people for medical professionals and taking on huge social work responsibilities. And so what the emerging data really suggests to us is that while the mortality rate highlights very significantly that there might be a gendered impact of the pandemic, suggesting that men are more severely affected, particularly with mortality, the broader impacts of the pandemic and the gendered effects go much more beyond the mortality rate. And so what we're quite clear about, at the minute at least, in terms of emerging data, is that there is a complexity to the gendered impact of the pandemic, and it goes much more widespread than we're perhaps thinking it ought to. Certain sectors of work, retail, hospitality, health and social care, childcare, really, we talk about it as work but not paid work, all of these have had a pronounced effect on women and women's rights and the way in which women exercise their rights during the pandemic. The ILO has shown in its initial research that there is a significant dominance of women in these roles with these responsibilities. And that is coupled with additional unpaid responsibilities, caring within the family, caring within the community, but also as an unpaid carer, and housework, and other things, all in a domestic context, which are not necessarily things we would recognise as pandemic-specific impacts. And so what we see as there is a phased return to normal is that there is also a significant lag in terms of gender versus non-gendered elements in recovery. But there's also a significant violence point here. And what we've seen through the pandemic is significant increases in interpersonal violence, significant increases in domestic violence, significant increases in online violence against women. And that has increased across the board in all of its different manifestations with its different harms. And the pandemic has also exacerbated and led to, arguably, new forms of technological violence, particularly coercion and control and increases in that, but also different forms of online violence, persistent Zoom bombing of events hosted by women's organisations and by organisations advocating for women's rights. And of course, there is the other side of this, the thing which has gained perhaps some more attention in certain states and others, and that is the abortion aspect, the element of reproductive rights, and how women are accessing those services during the pandemic. But it's an issue much broader than abortion. It's also about women's health rights generally and women's choices. And some governments have used the pandemic as an excuse to curtail abortion rights, which inevitably has led to protest. And the extent to which that has led to protest has been explicitly recognised at a UN level and has been explicitly recognised in some European states.
The fact that some governments have actually sought to take advantage of crisis to actually curtail women's rights has been recognized at the UN level by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in her report on the impact of the COVID pandemic on gender-based violence. What this has inevitably led to are mass protests. And as Kim mentioned, we've seen those taking place impact all around the globe. So, for instance, in Turkey, we saw women taking to the streets to protest government's decision to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, a key European treaty on violence against women and domestic violence. In Namibia, we've seen women protesting femicide and rising rates of rape and killings of women within Namibia. They've also taken to the online domain to protest within online communities with a hashtag shut it all down. Then again, in Argentina, we see women protesting the rise in domestic violence cases during the pandemic, but also femicide, which has risen quite significantly in Argentina during the first 2 months of the pandemic alone. We've seen there reported 50 femicides just within the first 2 months of lockdown, which was actually the highest number that was recorded in 10 years. But also within Europe, so a little closer to home, we've seen women taking to the streets to protect and to protect their rights and to fight for their rights. I think the first example perhaps is mostly recognized by everyone by now. This is a picture from Polish women's strike that has taken place and has been taking place actually continuously since the autumn of 2020. In response to the ruling of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal outlawing terminations in cases of severe health defects. We've seen actually huge social support for women's strike, which is now reaching close to 70% of the society, with thousands of people taking to the streets also to support women protesting for their rights. Again, not as far away, just over in Ireland, we've seen women organizing protests in the aftermath of Sarah Everard's murder, advocating for women's safety in public spaces. Again, these protests have also migrated to the online domain with a hashtag Reclaim the Streets. Last but not least, women in Kiev organized a march on women's rights, which coincided with International Women's Day on the 8th of March, just this year, calling their government for ratification of Istanbul Convention and for urgent action on combating violence against women, given the scale of violence in the country. However, this worldwide momentum for the fight for women's rights has come with a significant amount of backlash. Here we're noting only really 4 examples due to the constraints of the time, but we think that they are quite a powerful illustration of the consequences faced by women who even just speak about the rights, not to mention actually proactively fighting for them. So in the first illustration is actually the backlash that was faced by Labour MP and Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding, Jess Phillips, after she spoke out about the rise in domestic violence cases during the pandemic. She has faced an incredible amount of online abuse, including rape threats, for merely raising the issue that affects a lot of women during lockdowns. As in terms of what happened afterwards, not much. There was not much of an effective remedy to Jess Phillips, who received that amount of online abuse. Of course, the personal impact of online abuse, as we've argued elsewhere, is huge. But actually, we've seen only one of the abusers prosecuted. So actually, what we see is that there is no effective remedy really for the abuse that women face when they speak out about their rights. But also that raises, I think, a broader question about the failure to ensure that women can meaningfully and safely participate in public spaces, which are both offline and online. The second illustration is the new bill, Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which actually has some worrying implications for the right to protest itself, given the content of Section 59. And whilst this is not a piece of legislation that is women-specific, we decided to include it here, given that it has potentially significant implication for women's ability to protest and to fight for their rights. And drawing on that, we've also seen quite significant backlash to women protesters, especially in form of police brutality. And again, here one of the illustration is from Kill the Bill protests, with a woman being held to the ground by the police, but also in Poland, where a lot of women are reporting detentions on bogus charges, of being taken by the police to police stations outside the cities in which they protest, general level of harassment by the police whilst they are protesting, as well as the use of disproportionate force, including, for instance, use of tear gas, which was completely unjustified. However, what all these examples have highlighted is the importance of the right to protest at all times, but perhaps specifically so during the time of the pandemic. So I guess when we're looking at the experience of looking at women, violence, protest, and the pandemic, the question is, where do we go from here? What have we learned? Well, firstly, the experience of the pandemic has highlighted the need to protect women's rights at all times. But at the same time, it has highlighted quite significant gaps in responses towards preventing and combating violence against women in all its forms pre-pandemic. We've already mentioned the importance of protest, and here it comes also as a check on government powers. Again, during the pandemic, we've seen this being particularly significant, not only in relation to women's rights alone, but civil liberties more broadly. Given the scale of inequalities that the pandemic has unveiled, gender equality and ending GBV more generally appears to be absolutely central to the effective post-COVID recovery. Now, this is actually quite strongly aligned with the content of Sustainable Development Goals, but also with provisions, various legal provisions in international frameworks, not only those, but including those that protect women's rights, such as CEDAW, and for countries that ratified it, Istanbul Convention. Last but not least, I think one lesson learned during the pandemic is a lesson about the power of law, and the power of law in relation to protecting rights to protest, but also in addressing women's rights more broadly. But the question that arises from all of that is, how do we actually ensure that gender equality and ending GBV are centralized in the post-COVID recovery? Well, firstly, inclusion of women, women's voices and their lived experiences at every level of the response, planning, and recovery is absolutely necessary. That, of course, should extend to the involvement of women leaders. Now, I think we are not arguing that including women leaders automatically leads to gender equal outcomes. I think we've seen that this cannot be guaranteed, and perhaps we're sort of stepping away from that argument. However, what emerging research has shown is that actually policy responses to crisis by women have more favorable outcomes. It's also necessary to perhaps keep in mind a key lesson learned during this pandemic, and this is a lesson about duality of the power of law. So on the one hand, law is absolutely crucial in upholding rights and freedoms, including women's rights during the time of crisis. However, as we've witnessed, it doesn't take a very long time for the law to actually work against women and to be used or abused by some governments to curtail rights and freedoms. When that happens, the right to protest is actually more important than ever, again, as we've witnessed in the past year or so alone. And when we look at the protests during the course of this very pandemic, they significantly have a very strong women activism and women's rights narrative. However, they ought to be remembered not only as a fight or protest for women's rights, but actually as a lasting symbol of a fight for rights, freedoms, and democracy, not just for women, but for everyone. I think we can pause here, and I think Kim and I are looking forward to questions.
Yes, well, thank you. That's a fantastic paper covering a lot of ground, and we certainly welcome questions from our audience in the Q&A function. And perhaps I could ask that you stop sharing the screen now. That would be great. And if I can start, one thing that I'd welcome your thoughts on concerns how we seem to be seeing the pandemic unfolding at the same time as a kind of culture war, that's a reactionary culture war that's going on. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Particularly, I thought what was a striking comment that we saw in around some of the protests, that protecting statues seemed to be more important than protecting women.
Yeah, I can perhaps start with that. I think, particularly in the context of the Kill the Bill protest, this was certainly one of the issues that was raised, especially by women's groups that sort of suggested that actually we care more for statues and property than actually we care for women. Which actually I personally would agree with sort of that sentiment, that the new bill absolutely seems to ignore maybe miss an opportunity to actually introduce any provisions that would potentially go quite some way in preventing violence against women and combating it. I think on the point of a culture war, I think this is not something that just arose during the pandemic. I think it's just something that pandemic exacerbated. But I don't know if Kim wants to add anything to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree. I think the way in which the power of law has been perhaps subverted, disrupted, shoved to one side hasn't done women any favours. And I think the way in which we're talking about cancel culture and the way in which some other law reforms are ongoing in the background are not helpful for any of those debates more broadly. And I think actually there's been significant damage done. I think the statute protests have their place, but I think property has very much come out on top. And I think that tells us quite a lot about the rights we valued most, particularly during lockdown and the pandemic more broadly. And I don't think that is necessarily a reflection of the values we have as society, nor maybe the values we should aspire to have in society.
It's interesting you mentioned the power of law in the presentation and in that response. And I wonder if you could just maybe tease out a bit kind of how you position your work in relation to ideas about feminism and the power of law. And of course, I can't help but think back to Carol Smart's insights when you were talking about that.
Sure, I think it's absolutely central to our work in terms of especially the impact that we've seen during the pandemic. I think there's been so much attention being paid to law and emergency laws being passed, that I think we've missed a bigger picture that has arose again, not just now. I mean, it's been in literature for over 3 decades, about the power of law and law actually not always working for women, and not always being necessarily a protector of women's rights. I guess we're taking a little bit of a middle approach to that, in a way that I think we've seen a potential for law to actually step in, especially during the times of emergency, and actually bring in frameworks that remind governments or those that tend to abuse women's rights and freedoms that actually there are some higher standards and obligations that still apply even in cases of emergency. And here I'm particularly looking towards international, supranational laws. But I think it's hard to be optimistic about it. And I think the one lesson that is learned is that, especially in times of emergency, it is quite easy for laws or for governments to use laws to severely curtail women's rights.
Thank you. The other question I'd raise concerns something that was mentioned towards the outset of the paper around what we might call the digital divide and that's impact. And I wonder if you've thought a bit about how to understand obviously the digital divides in a lot of ways, but how particularly we can see it as gendered.
Well, so it's an interesting question, and I think the first part is the way in which we just assume that people can access digital anything. I think there is a huge amount of expectation that because we can do it, everybody can do it, or because the government can do it, everybody can do it. And we've seen in schools, which is not specifically gendered, but the issues where some had and some didn't have. And that really manifests itself also in the community. Certain groups don't have the access we have, but even if they do have the access, don't have the skills, the knowledge, and the ability to use it the way that we perhaps can use it. And so a large part of that also falls on the shoulders of people who don't have the time to use it. If they're working low-paid jobs, they're working more hours, they don't have the time to engage online in the way that we would. So the impact, particularly on women who are doing the caring, the childcare, the housework, and trying to hold down whatever underemployment or employment they can get, there's a significant divide between what they can do and what we think they can do, but also even where women do engage online, particularly, and especially where that is about protest or contentious issues, there is this huge online backlash for daring to speak out about women's rights online anyway. So the first battle is we have to get women online and get them to engage online, provide them the means to do it. And the second battle is how do we get them to do that in a safe space online? Because if you get kind of burnt initially, then there is a barrier there, which is an additional barrier to the barrier that you would otherwise not have had if you were perhaps not engaging in that way. So it's an issue which needs a lot more work, but the barriers are there, and dismantling those barriers is part and parcel of the problem. But we're not there yet, not even close.
Yeah. Well, I think our time is exhausted on the paper, but I want to thank you both. It was a fascinating paper, raises a lot of issues, and look forward to seeing the written form in due course. So thanks very much. To our final speakers today, who are Dr. Lindsay Mitchell and Dr. Michelle Weldon-Johns. Lindsay is a lecturer in law at Abertay University in Scotland. Her research straddles international human rights law and feminist legal theory. She's interested in narratives of women's rights and law's understanding of women's rights. She's working on a funded project exploring perceptions of reproductive rights within human rights. Michelle is a senior lecturer in law, also at Abertay University. Her research interest is the boundaries between work and family life from employment and equality law perspectives. She's a particular interest in working fathers, atypical working families, and emerging boundaries of work-life conflict, such as assisted reproduction. Their paper is entitled Laws Invisible Women, the Unintended Gendered Consequences of the COVID-19 Lockdown. Welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Carol. I'll just start sharing this now. Hopefully you can see that all.
That's
all
great.
Right. Thank
Yep.
you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us. Today, Lindsay and I, as Carol mentioned, are going to speak about Laws Invisible Women, the unintended gendered consequences of the COVID-19 lockdown. And we're going to look at this from two particular perspectives. So I'm going to look at it from the perspective of women's work and the impact that school closures and childcare closure settings have had on women's work, and the potential for flexible working as a response to this. And Lindsay's going to look at the impact on women's health. In particular, she's going to look at abortion care in that context. And in doing so, we're going to think about the absence of women's voices in this context and the ways in which the decisions around these areas have reified gender stereotypes in the government's legal responses to the pandemic. So we ground our analysis in these early feminist critiques of law, which have considered law to privilege male rights. And in doing so, we reflect on what scholars such as Nafin argue, that law is based on a male subject with a male middle-class masculinity, which doesn't reflect or respond to the lived experiences of women. And this is also evident in the employment sphere, where scholars such as Pateman argue that the standard worker model is a male worker model, unburdened with caring responsibilities, reinforcing the division between the public world of work and the private sphere of home and family life, also used by James in the context of the unencumbered worker model in the work-family context. And we reflect on what Naveen has said here. So consistently, the law has imposed on women the roles of childbearer, child rearer, and domestic servant. And we argue that the COVID responses have reified these particular gendered roles by failing to acknowledge the impact that they will have, certain policies, certain decisions will have on women. Consequently, we argue that the impact and the potential legacy then of the COVID pandemic is a regression in feminist gains, which have unpicked these gendered assumptions and stereotypes within law. And instead, we go back to a reinforcement of the of these gendered roles and reflect on the interrelationship between these spheres and interdependency between them as well, in order to work in the public sphere of work with women holding the two worlds together, as Nafin has also argued. And we use our two examples today to explore some particular consequences of this. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to focus on the particular impact of the closure of schools and childcare settings and the disproportionate impact that this has had on women. And there have been various studies in relation to this that have reinforced the impact that this has had on women. And I've just referred to two of these here on the slides, the ONS data and that from the Fawcett Society, and both of which really reinforce that it's clear that women have borne the brunt of the responsibility for unpaid care and homeschooling during the pandemic. And not only that, but women have also undertaken the greater challenge of trying to balance those responsibilities with their paid employment and have suffered the greatest challenges and consequences of doing that, not only in the shorter term of the actual experiences of the pandemic, but also in the longer term with their future implications for their work, the potential for promotion and things like that in the future as well. And so this is not just that sort of ongoing an initial consequence, it's got ongoing repercussions for working women. And this is also true even where there were fathers working from home as well. So even where the opportunity to undertake a greater sharing of caring roles was present, that hasn't really been the reality for many working families. Instead, what the pandemic has exposed is the fragility of women's labour market engagement and the resilience of traditional gender roles, reinforcing this interdependency of public and private spheres and the tendency to return back to traditional gender roles when this breaks down. In doing so, it either highlights a failure to appreciate the implications of lockdown and things like school closures and nursery setting closures that they would have on working women with caring responsibilities, or a willful disregard for the disproportionate impact that it created. And while those decisions may have been appropriate at the time, what is key now is thinking about how we respond to that. How will law and policy respond to that to try and readdress this gender imbalance that has been created by the pandemic? And I think worryingly, the recent research published just earlier this month by the Policy Institute at King's College London and Ipsos Mori highlights that gender inequality is not being viewed as a priority for Britons in the kind of post-pandemic context. And only, as it says on the slide, only 23% of Britons identified this as an area, a priority area in terms of inequality, compared with 33% on average across Europe. And my concern with that is that translates into policy and decision making in the post-pandemic period, and that women continue to remain invisible in that context. And as the authors of the study note, that it seems that we've already forgotten the impact that it's had on women's work already, and the disproportionate impact, such as the increased burdens of care that women have undertaken to. And it's worrying that might be the way forward when we start to move in a kind of post-pandemic responses. Well, what can we do then? What are the potential benefits? What can we learn from the pandemic? What has it highlighted in this particular context? Well, there has been a lot said about the benefits of flexible working, and that employers have had the opportunity to see how they can move towards flexible modes of working for their employees. Who knew flexible working could have positive impacts for work-life balance? It's just taken a pandemic to demonstrate that this is possible. And with that, there have also been calls for the normalisation of flexible work, and we see that by Liz Truss, the Minister for Women Inequalities, and the BIT research and flexible work that was undertaken for them. And we see some recommendations to work towards this normalisation of flexible work, as well as obviously some employers taking those steps themselves. However, it's important to bear in mind that actually we already do have a right to request flexible working, and we've had such a right for a number of years, and that right has been available not just to those with caring responsibilities, but to everyone with 26 weeks continuity of employment already. So that already exists. And the recommendations that are being proposed perhaps don't really go far enough to really address the kind of gendered implications that we've seen from the pandemic in terms of women's work. So the first recommendation is to advertise jobs as available flexibly. And the second recommendation is to make it a day one right to request flexible work. And while these aren't unwelcome suggestions and recommendations, they don't really get to the root of the problem with flexible working regulations themselves, which are inherently that it's only a right to request, it's a permanent change in whatever the request is, and there isn't any real recourse to challenge an employer's decision to refuse a request for flexible working. And the best ways in which people can achieve some remedies is to instead use the Equality Act and sex discrimination legislation there, which again reinforces and entrenches gender roles. It's also important to bear in mind, and Chung and van der Leep identify various research that highlights that when we talk about flexible working, for women, flexible working often means a reduction in hours and a double burden of work and care. And so actually flexible working can sometimes make it much more difficult to balance work and family commitments because of the competing demands of both. Whereas flexible working for men quite often means greater autonomy and flexibility without reducing hours or pay, and things like working from home. And if the experience of the pandemic is that we are valuing in terms of flexible work, well, quite often that has been very much in line with Naveen's standard male worker norm, where it's been a very white white collar middle class style of flexible working, where people are just doing the same job they would have done in person but at home. And if that's the model of flexible work that's being valued, then I'm not really sure that really gets to the heart of helping redress gender inequality and challenge work-family issues therein. Instead, what we need is to re-envisage the work-family dichotomy to support working families much more fully and challenge traditional gender roles, The right to carers leave that the government consulted on, I think last year, is a good start, although more robust rights would be better. And more stronger rights and more identifiable rights for fathers is also important here too. And as the others have mentioned, addressing the absence of women's voices here and making them more visibly included in decision making to ensure it meets their needs is also essential. And also thinking about employers making things more resilient and responsive to make things easier to challenges easier to respond to in the future. And most importantly, the importance of care infrastructures, because without this, it's clear that women's paid work remains vulnerable and fragile because it continues to be viewed as ancillary to men's work. And I'm just going to hand over to Lindsay now.
Right. So thank you, Michelle. And I'll just get you to flick through the slides if you don't mind. So following on from what Michelle has just said, I'm going to focus on women's reproductive health and look at how, conversely, the pandemic has apparently produced opportunities to provide a more women-friendly approach to healthcare. Now, while this is to be welcomed, we extrapolate from this that there are still invisible barriers to centring women's needs and women's lived experience at the heart of reproductive healthcare services. So I use the example of abortion care in Scotland and set out how the pandemic essentially forced a radical rethink of abortion care and allowed service providers to offer treatment that is flexible and works for women and people seeking abortion. Yet this raises questions as to why it's taken a global pandemic to force the Scottish Government and others to implement such a service. And we're interested in what this tells us about the visibility of women when it comes to law and policy making. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just some quick context. Many of you will be familiar with this. For those of you who aren't, though, abortion is governed by the 1967 Abortion Act. It restricts legal abortions to those performed by a registered medical practitioner on specific grounds and also to an approved location. The Act allows ministers to approve individual premises for this purpose. So in Scotland, in 2017, Scottish ministers approved the Pregnant Women's Home as such a place where a legal termination could be carried out. This meant that women who were undergoing an early medical abortion could attend a clinic for the first pill, which is mifepristone, and then they would be allowed to take the second pill, which is misoprostol, at home. Previously, women had to attend on separate days and were mandated to take both of these pills on the clinic premises. The reality, though, was that the women were then free to leave with the idea that they would complete the termination at home. However, many women across Scotland routinely reported beginning to pass their pregnancy on public transport, particularly if they lived rurally, could not afford a taxi, or had not been accompanied to the clinic by a driver. So circumstances that were clearly untenable. And yet, after the Scottish Government implemented the new regulations in 2017, these regulations, obviously allowing for women to take misoprostol at home, were challenged by the anti-choice group, the SPUC, in the Court of Session. Both the first instance and the appeal cases upheld the lawfulness of these regulations. Indeed, I would go further, and some women's groups and abortion rights groups at the time argued that the judgment effectively endorsed ministers going further and therefore permitting women to be prescribed both of the pills to take at home. Despite various campaigns for this, which is known as self-managed abortion, at the time the Scottish Government said that it had no plans to make any further regulations, and therefore as of 2017 it meant that women were still mandated to attend a clinic in person, and they had to take the first pill on the premises. They were therefore allowed to leave and take the second pill at home. The next slide, please. This all changed, though, when the global pandemic hit. So the COVID lockdown forced radical rethinks about in-person treatment. Many GP and outpatient services were moved very quickly to online consultations. And in early 2020, Scotland's Chief Medical Officer released guidance that for the first time said that women and pregnant people seeking abortions would be able to have an online consultation, and they would be allowed to be prescribed both pills to take at home, meaning that there was no need for anyone to attend a clinic in person. This is known, I'm sure some of you will come across this term, this is now known as telemedical abortion. This has been touted by various groups as one of the health successes of the pandemic. Early research suggests that the majority of those patients who have undergone abortions this way state that they have preferred to use telemedicine rather than having to attend a clinic. Abortion service providers also report that they are able to offer a comprehensive service for the first time, putting women's needs at the centre. Given that this was achieved in Scotland by the use of ministerial powers that the courts had already determined were legal, it asks us to pose the question as to why such a welcome service could not have been provided prior to the pandemic. What is even more worrying, though, is that even in the face of the reported success of telemedical abortion, both the UK and the Scottish governments have recently held public consultations on whether or not to continue the service after the pandemic. As various groups have pointed out, it's difficult to think of any other healthcare where best practice is dependent on a public consultation. Next slide. So what has this highlighted? Well, again, it highlights that once again the framing of abortion is that abortion is framed as controversial or political rather than the routine medical healthcare that it is. So such framing of abortion as controversial is problematic because it immediately negates women's experiences and needs and instead allows patriarchal and paternalistic ideology to set the agenda and govern law and policy making and affect women's lives. Next slide. So we would argue that in terms of what we can say about law and policy making, it's clear that the pandemic has blurred the distinction between the public and the private spheres, with homes becoming workspaces and work increasingly being brought into our homes. Yet while this blurring of spheres has been welcomed by many, we would argue that the traditionally feminine roles and responsibilities have very firmly remained in the private sphere, so much so that there's a failure to see these roles when it comes to lawmaking in the pandemic. As such, while there's a porous intersection of the public and the private, the gendered realities within these two spheres are being cemented, with women having to withdraw from public lives to provide care and women's medical needs becoming an afterthought for public policy makers. Last slide. So, as early feminist scholars told us, law is not neutral and is generally centred around the needs of white middle-class heterosexual married men. While this has been the focus of decades of feminist scholarship, many advances have been made in making women visible in lawmaking. However, the pandemic has been narrativised by many as an opportunity to embrace radical thinking and solutions, and many have expressed hope that life will not necessarily go back to normal, but that we will embrace many of the successes, such as home working, flexible working, online consultation, and greater use of online and technological services. However, as we've highlighted, even when these such successes are celebrated, they're actually successes for Nafine's man of law. As Michelle mentioned earlier, tokenism around women's real childcare burdens means that terms such as family-friendly and flexible have not in any way served to improve things for actual women. In the same way, whilst the expansion of telemedical abortion did appear to be a pandemic success and could be celebrated for centering women's experiences, it's been accompanied by caution that it will not be permanent and saw the government canvassing public opinion on its continuation, suggesting that once again other factors take priority in women's reproductive health over women's needs. This leads us to conclude that the caution of scholars like Nafine, who set out the danger in law being organised around the wants and needs of an idealised man, is still very relevant today. Indeed, if we don't make a real effort to centre women's lives within law and policy making, there's a real danger that women's gains and achievements will be set back decades. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for a fascinating paper, two distinct areas, but with obvious connections that were brought together so well in the conclusion. I want to start with a question, sort of two-part, one for each of you. First of all, with respect to the world of work, the point you make a really important point about the seeming resilience of traditional gender roles and the way in which they seem to come back with a vengeance in the conditions of lockdown. But I do wonder, it's really difficult, and I wonder how you deal with this, to make any sort of generalizations about lockdown and the world of work because of the different ways in which people are positioned. And, I was thinking as you were speaking about, the cleaner in an essential service who now is trying to deep clean on a regular basis, doesn't sound very flexible at all as a workplace. I also thought about, in a context where the statistics show that people are working more when they're working at home. So flexibility seems to mean the ability to do more work. These incredibly different experiences and how one generalizes. And second part, with respect to terminations, I mean, this seems to be a really interesting example around telehealth, where the collapse of the public-private seems actually to create space for progressive change. And I suppose the question is, will that be a permanent change, or is the new normal going to be an old normal? So, response from each of you. Maybe Michelle, if you want to start.
Thank you, Carol. I think that's a really important point that you make, because I think there is quite a lot of discussion right now about how flexible working and working from home has been this amazing experience. It's opened up employers' eyes to new ways of working, new ways of thinking about work, the very nature of work. But as you say, that doesn't work for everyone. The idea of flexibility suits a very particular type of work. It suits kind of middle class, white collar worker very well, and the idea of promoting flexible work as a solution to women's the challenges that women have faced during the pandemic, or other workers, is only part of the picture. And there are great benefits to working from home, to flexible working for various different groups, and it opens up opportunities for people who can't work in physical workspaces for various reasons. And there are opportunities to be gained there. But the idea that this is the government's response to trying to redress the issues that have been faced during the pandemic and the issues around work-family conflict, is in no way going to help, like you say, someone who has to physically work in a workplace. And the ideas of flexibility just don't work there as well as they might elsewhere. And the idea that this is going to be the new normal for everyone, it's just not reality for people either. And so I have used flexible working as this idea, is it a response? Is it going to address these issues? But my answer to that is no, I don't think so at all. I think it will for some people. Absolutely, there are opportunities to be gained, but it's not a one-size-fits-all model. And this can't be the only response that we have in terms of work and how we redefine work. And how we renegotiate our relationship with work, particularly around care as well. And it has to be part of a broader rethinking of the package of work-family rights that we have, and reconsidering whether they continue to be fit for purpose. And particularly, and I saw that Grace has put a question in the chat about fathers' rights as well, and rethinking fathers' rights, giving them a much greater role, because whilst I did say that mostly women have done this during the pandemic, that is not the truth for every family, and fathers have stepped up in some families, not to the same extent as women, generally speaking. But there are opportunities there, and it seems to me that for that policymakers, government need to be capitalising on that too, and not just ignoring that, and thinking about how we redefine and enhance the rights that already exist for other groups too, to make greater gains more generally here, and make workplaces more resilient, people, families more resilient, so we don't just fall back to gender roles all the time.
And Lindsay.
So thank you for that question, Carl. I would like to agree with you, because I think the common sense approach is to think that, well, the pandemic has forced many of us to rethink things and come up with radical solutions that, for various reasons, we just might not have done that before. So I think initially a lot of people would say, well, there was various reasons for not having telemedical abortion. There was various reasons, whether they were political policy, or maybe some people just have said, well, this hasn't been tried and tested enough. Obviously, though, the pandemic made it happen. I think what is interesting, though, is that, I think conversely people would say, well, yes, but is it a worse service? Is it just a stopgap? Perhaps people would prefer to go back to the normal, but there have been various studies carried out. Some of them are sort of still ongoing. There's a big study, I don't have the citation or anything to hand, undertaken in England and Wales, where it suggests that, telemedical abortion is better. This works better for pregnant people because, having to attend a clinic in person simply to swallow pills, these days does not in any way fit in with, what abortion meant in the 1960s. So I think for many people, this was a huge success. We now have it. It's working. The research says it's good. The research says it's safe. The research says it's what women want. So I think it was with huge disappointment that, the government here in Scotland, but certainly, in England and Wales as well, they keep making the point that, this is not permanent. This is not permanent. And I think that, we have to, hold them to account more and say, why? And I think behind the scenes, a lot of the people say, well, why? Because of the anti-choice groups were so vehemently opposed to this. And people were very disappointed that they're running these public consultations whilst we were still in a pandemic and whilst we were actually using telemedicine, which for a lot of abortion organisations said, well, it made it clear as if to say, well, we're already winding this up. So I'm involved with a group that we're kind of campaigning to ask women who'd used the service to fill in the consultation. But there was an acknowledgement that a lot of anti-choice groups, particularly the ones that are funded by the US, they have a lot of means at their disposal, and they tend to respond to these things in much greater numbers. So there's been a lot of questioning about whether or not abortion service providers and women's organisations, should they even have engaged with the consultation? Because I think a lot of them are saying that actually this has been undertaken in bad faith. So I think there is a lot of worry that something that seems to be a sensible outcome from the pandemic, of course we should keep this. And what's more, as I mentioned in the presentation, in Scotland, we actually do have case law on this. We have a first instance and an appeal court judgment that said the use of these powers to designate a woman's home, as a lawful place under the Abortion Act, this has been designated as legal. So you have to be really quite cynical to say, well, what possible reason could you have for reverting back to normal? And we don't have one, so you have to sort of essentially fill in the blanks yourself, I'm afraid.
And it does also raise a broader, interesting general question about what innovations that have come about during the pandemic are considered to be temporary and which are considered to be permanent, and why. So that's something that maybe we should be interrogating those in government about. What gets categorized as a necessary evil, and what becomes this brave new world of work and life.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Carol. I think that is a really key question too, because there is a lot of debate about whether home working indeed should be the new normal. Even within the highest ranks of government, there is, disagreement about that too. So we see Boris Johnson wanting everyone back at work, and we see others wanting to adopt this kind of model. So we don't really know what way forward, do we?
And you mentioned the question we have from our audience, from Grace James, one of the participants in this series in our audience. pointing out that there is evidence that fathers have undertaken more, albeit limited, and particular, childcare, domestic work. And I guess this goes to the question of permanence versus a temporary situation born of necessity as well.
Yeah, that's very true. So, yeah, to what extent have fathers undertaken that role because they are physically there and they're able to do it, and to what extent does that actually translate into them wanting to exercise work-family rights? So, to take unpaid parental leave, for instance, or to renegotiate their working hours through formal requests for flexible working. And I think that's something that probably needs to be investigated much more thoroughly because, as I mentioned before, there's quite a lot of focus on flexible working, home working as the new normal, and with that an expectation that obviously translates into extra care and better work-life balance for people. But as you also rightly said, Carol, working from home, working flexibly often means working more for many people, and particularly where we are in situations where there aren't childcare infrastructures in place. So we have schools back, we have some childcare settings back, but we don't have all of them. And so many working women, myself included, don't have full support childcare structures and have to manage or work around those for who knows how long. And so we do see these kinds of implications that are a part of the pandemic, a response to it, and during the pandemic. But to what extent are those going to translate into wider changes, and certainly policy changes in relation to work-family rights? And are they going to be driven by fathers? Because that's the only real way I think that we'll see lasting change.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for a terrific paper. And once again, really looking forward to the written version in due course. So I'd like now to thank our speakers for joining us today and presenting these really incredibly rich, deeply textured, and such timely papers. Thank you as well to our audience for joining us and for your participation. Our next and final workshop in the series will be on the 19th of May at 1800 British Summer Time, and I hope you will join me then for the conclusion of the series. But until then, it's goodbye from the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. Goodbye.